Hello. Yeah. Hi guys, I guess we are live.
Yeah.
Yeah. Hi everyone. Good evening. Good evening. We have with us again Raghav Gupta sir. Yesterday we had talked a lot, and it was a great talk yesterday. We learned a lot from him about maybe yeah, it was really related to UPSC, but I think it can be applicable in many aspect of life, whatever he said. And today he's gonna talk about wildlife photography and many other interests which he pursues. Yeah, so over to him.
Thank you, Rahul. And so, without wasting more time, I think we've already a little bit late. So, I think people are already waiting. We can start off. So, good evening to everyone, and very happy that everybody's getting part of this conversation on wildlife and wildlife photography. So, I hope I'll be able to inspire you in some way through my work, which I've been doing. In wildlife, and hope to convey the message of how amazing the biodiversity and how amazing our natural environment is. And all we need to do is spend some time with it, and we'll have some amazing memories. So without much ado, I am starting the PPT here, and we can go ahead. And of course, any questions you can ask. That's not a problem. Yeah, there we are. So Aman, Rahul, I hope you can see the PPT. The others too, I hope.
Yes, sir, we can see it.
Yes, sir, we can see.
Great. So I'll start off. So, this webinar we'll be talking about wildlife photography, and we'll talk about some tips and how to you can use wildlife photography and how you can improve your photography, especially with respect to creatures, birds, and animals. And so here's an overview. And the first part we talk about wildlife photography, the basic tips of how to go about what are the basic things which you need to take care of to get your photographs which are impressive. And this we'll be talking about exposure. We'll be talking about framing and the rule of thirds, and we'll be talking about the types of wildlife photography. So I have some of my photographs, and we'll be through those photos. I'll be telling you what kind of different techniques you can use, and you can get really interesting results. Then part two, we'll be talking about 5 or 6 photo stories, in which we'll be discussing how certain photos can communicate a story, how they can narrate a story, and you feel that you're there and you're sort of looking at the photo. You can imagine yourself being there and seeing events unfolding right in front of your eyes. And part three would be careers and courses. I would actually be talking more about courses, but I feel careers, maybe this is not the right forum, but courses in wildlife. And the last would be an interactive session, but you can of course interrupt me anytime you want. So Rahul, Aman, just let me know if I need to stop anytime. You can say excuse me, sir, or just just say sir, or whatever you want, so I can answer the questions. Moving on, we have part one, which is wildlife photography 101. So here we'll talk about exposure first. So exposure is probably the most important part of any photograph, besides wildlife photography, of course. Why is it important in wildlife? Because typically, wildlife we normally encounter in the earliest part of the day, that is early morning, or evenings. And that means the light is always a challenge. That is number one. Number two is that many times these subjects, your animals, your birds, they're moving in the forest, or they're moving in such areas where there's an alternate between shade and light. So again, you need to get the exposure correct. So that is why wildlife photography in particular becomes very challenging when it comes to this particular component of photography, that's exposure. And exposure by itself is made of 3 things, and I like to call them the exposure trifecta. And these 3 things are very common. You might have heard of them, but I'll gloss over them quickly. The first is called aperture, which is basically the structure in the camera which controls how much or the quantity of light which enters into the camera and falls onto the sensor. And this is measured in f-stops, such as f by 1.4, f by 4, f by 8. So you can imagine being a little, going into mathematics, that since this is a numerator and a denominator, it's a fraction, so the larger the denominator, the smaller the number. Hence, if you have, and vice versa. So f1.4 actually is a very large aperture, which means it's the largest possible aperture. And at the same time, if you increase the denominators going from 1.4 to 4 to 8 and so on, maybe till f32, that means you're slowly reducing the aperture, which means that you are eventually controlling lesser amount of light entering into the camera. And why is this relevant? Well, if you have an extremely bright setting, let's say you have bright snow and you have a snow leopard sitting there, then you probably would need to reduce your aperture. But at the same time, if it's night and you have, let's say, a leopard right in front of you, then you might want to increase your aperture a little bit, which means the F number. The second component of the trifecta is shutter speed. Now, shutter speed measures how long light enters into the camera. How long means it is measuring time duration. So it is measured in seconds, like 1 second, 2 seconds, 1/200th of a second, 1/6400th of a second, and so on. So you can have various different ranges of time durations, and according to your perception of what the current scene you want to portray, you might change your shutter speed. And last is ISO. The ISO controls the sensitivity towards light, and this is a slightly new concept because the sensors are very highly sensitive these days, becoming more and more sensitive to light, and hence ISO controls how sensitive you want a sensor to be, and they are measured from values ranging from 100 to 10,000. So 100 being the lowest, which means that the lower the value, the less sensitive the ISO is to the light. Which means if you have a very bright setting, you would want to set the ISO to be low. But if you want a very, let's say, a setting which has very less light, then you would want to maximize your sensitivity towards light, and therefore you would increase ISO to, let's say, 5,000, 7,000, even more. But this comes at a cost. The more the ISO, the grainier or noisier the image. Now, this noise is very different from pixelation. Pixels is something to do with resolution in terms of megapixels, for example. So that so it's comprising of the number of elements which are making up your picture, because pixel literally means pictured element. But on the other hand, ISO is something to do with graininess. That's something called noise. You'll have little specks of red and blue. You might notice that you have a very dark photo, and you have, instead of a plain black background or a plain even background, you have a slightly uneven background, and that is because of the increase in ISO. So that sensitivity comes at a cost, and we need to find a perfect balance which sort of allows it to be sensitive, but at the same time, it reduces noise as well. So broadly, if this is the theoretical part of exposure, I hope people may be aware of this. And besides these three, so they are the essential elements, all these three factors control three other things as well. So as I said, aperture was controlling the amount of light, shutter speed was controlling how long the light entered, that is the time duration, and ISO control the sensitivity. So how do we expand them to more real terms? How do we physically understand what's happening? Now, aperture is related with depth of field. And depth of field can be simply understood as this way. You might have seen a lot of photographs with a completely blurred background, and it looks very pleasing aesthetically. You understand this. Oh yes, there's nothing in the background. The image is striking, and the subject stands out. So that is called having a shallow depth of field, which means that the field or the depth of field is very little. You can only see the subject, nothing beyond it, nothing in front of it, nothing beyond it. The more you increase the depth of field, the more the background and the foreground comes into the fore. Always remember, it's both the foreground and the background. So if you are increasing the field, you're increasing both ways. And if the more you're decreasing, the more you're limiting a particular area to be in a particular focal length. So that is what also is controlled by the aperture, besides the amount of light. Shutter speed, besides controlling the amount of time, also controls motion blur, which means that if you have a moving subject and you want that a particular subject to have a motion blur, which means that you want, let's say it's a flight of bird, and you want the entire wing of the bird to be coming slightly blurred to give a very aesthetically pleasing image, you can do that by having a low shutter speed. On the other hand, if you have a very high shutter speed, then the image will turn to be very crisp, very clear, but you will not have that dynamism which sometimes motion blur can give you. And of course, the ISO, as I said, is related with the noise. So we, of course, would want ISO to be related as low as possible so that noise doesn't crop up. And at the same time, your dark images are properly exposed. So balancing these 3 points, aperture, shutter speed, and ISO, is what is called exposure. So if your image is properly exposed, it means it has the right amount of aperture, right amount of shutter speed, right amount of ISO. But when I say right amount, I do not mean it in absolute terms. For a given photographer, a setting would be very differently perceived from another one. So this is entirely up to you, how you create your image. So this is an example I would like to share. Here we have, this was a very cloudy day, so I had to increase my aperture. So the aperture is at its maximum. And this bird is called the black-bellied tern. And this is a very rare bird, it's highly endangered, found in the rivers of northern India, including Chambal, where it was taken in Madhya Pradesh. And as you can see that the wings are very sharp, which means it had a very fast shutter speed, no blur at all. And at the same time, you can see a very even background. That's because of a very shallow depth of field. The aperture was f1.4, which is the maximum for this lens, and that's why it turned out this way. So you can see you can just barely make out that there's some green kind of vegetation behind, but not really what. At the same time, here's another image. This is from Nalsarovar, Gujarat, and this is a Dalmatian pelican, again an endangered bird, but it's a huge one. It's like a jumbo jet. But here, this was an extremely bright, sunny day. So had I increased the aperture, had it been like, let's say f1.4, f2, then what would have happened is the whitish part, especially the feathers, would have been overexposed, and you wouldn't be able to see those fine lines between the feathers. So I had to reduce that. But in the process of reducing the aperture, what has happened is I have increased my depth of field. That's fine, because thankfully the depth of field was still very far. So you can in the background, you can see a lot of reeds, a lot of green vegetation, which has come into focus, slightly more than the other one, the image we just saw. Also, you'll see that the shutter speed was 1/6400th of a second. So you see on the left side, those water droplets are very clear. And that's because the shutter speed was very high. So that's how you balance, these a couple of factors, and that's how you get an image. So that's more or less about exposure. I won't be dwelling too much on this because it becomes very technical. I would rather move on to framing and rule of thirds. Now, before moving on to this, basically, exposure is the mechanics of a camera, which means that you're literally looking at the machine itself. Aperture is part of the camera, the ISO is part of the sensor, and so on. Framing and rule of thirds is something which is entirely in your hands. This is the creative part. So the other part was technical, more technique oriented, whereas framing and rule of thirds is entirely aesthetics. This is entirely in your hands, how you want to frame. You have your entire freedom to craft a particular image. And we'll talk about framing, the general ideas of what basic rules can be followed. The first one is called the rule of thirds. And what do? We take our image or our frame and divide it into 9 equal parts by 2 horizontal and 2 vertical lines. We just see how, like this. So as you can see, there are two horizontal lines and 2 vertical lines, and there are 9 equal parts of the image. And as you can see, there are 4 points of intersection. The points of interest of the image, that is, let's say the eye of the tiger, or let's say a particular part of the bird which you want to highlight, whichever part of the image which you want to be the focus of the image, really the key point of the image. Or let's say it's a landscape shot and you have a tiger right at the bottom in a very small frame. So you want the tiger to be highlighted. So then that particular point should lie on any of these intersecting points. That's as simple as that. So you have these 4 points of intersection, and any of these points, you could have the point of interest lying on any of these 4 points. That's rule thirds part 1. The part 2 of rule of thirds says that the horizon of the image should lie on the horizontal lines. That is, these 2 lines, the blue ones. Which means that ideally, let's say you have a situation, you're at the beach and you have half land and half sky, and you want to capture an image. What would you usually do? You wouldn't think about it, you'll say half-half, which means half of the land and half of the sky. So that is incorrect if you look at it in terms of the rule of thirds. So ideally what you should do is, wherever the horizon is, that should lie either on the top, first third part of it, or the bottom. And that sort of increases the aesthetics of the image. We'll see some examples and you'll see how it works out. And by the way, this is valid for both portrait and landscape framing. Last but not least, you should always leave some space for the subject to interact with its habitat. When I say interact with its habitat, I mean in the photograph. So what I'm trying to say is that don't try to squeeze in your photo so much that there's nothing left around the subject. So either the subject should be either on the left or on the right, so that there's enough space as if to move around. And that space is called the negative space. So make sure that there's some space left behind. This is a classic, good books, rule of third kind of image. And this beautiful bird is called the Oriental Dwarf Kingfisher, one of the most colorful birds from Western Ghats. This was taken in Chiplun, Maharashtra, and it's a treat to watch, and it's a favorite amongst photographers. You can clearly see how it has a wonderful number of colors. So as you can see, analyzing from the rule of thirds, the eye of the bird, which is the crucial interest, or even the bug, lies at a point of interest. At the same time, the twig on which the bird is perched is actually falling very closely to the horizontal line. So as you can see, the image is divided into 3 parts, and there's a lot of negative space on the right side of the bird. Similarly, here's another one. This is the black bug from the outskirts of Nashik, and you can see that the subject, that is the head of the buck, which is more point of interest, is lying around the point of the point of intersection, and at the same time, you can see the beautiful landscape, the dry scrub area, and there's a horizon there, which is lying on the horizontal line. So this is one example to show how rule of third works. And here's another one which doesn't have a, let's say, a living being, but this is one of my favorite places. It's Arunachal Pradesh, and you can see that the sun is lying slightly on the left side, and again you'll see the rule of thirds, which means it's slightly on the around the point of interest. And you had an alternate. You could have clicked it this way, with the sun bang in the center, and this would have violated the rule of thirds. And you can see also that aesthetically, if you look at this photo, and if you look at this photo, this particular photo where the sun is on the left actually strikes you a little bit more appealing than the other one. So that's the example of rule of thirds. And here's another one. This is another beautiful bird called the red-billed blue magpie, and I clicked this in Uttarakhand, and the outskirts of place. And here you can see that this entire bird is actually scrunched up in the frame, and this is actually violating the rule of thirds. You can see the eyes of the bird doesn't lie anywhere along the point of interest, and the horizon, this doesn't seem to be a particular horizon as well. So what do we do here? Well, this was my choice, and that's exactly what I wanted to bring to you, that the rule of thirds is an indication, it's a guideline that you can follow it more often than not. But then there may be situations like I wanted the entire bird, because it has a beautiful long tail, and I wanted this entire frame to be fitted up, fully in the frame and nothing else. So from head to tail, you fix the bird, and there's no possibility of space left behind. So that's one of the examples where the rule of thirds can be broken if you feel so. And here's another example. This is a purple sunbird, a very common bird, and this was in Jaisalmer, Rajasthan. And you can see again that the eye of the bird, which is the point of interest, is lying around the the point of intersection, and this is again following the rule of thirds. So that's about basically how framing and rule of thirds can govern your photography. And I can take a pause here, maybe a brief 1 or 2 minutes. So if there's any kind of urgent questions or anything related to framing or techniques, we can take up right now. Rahul, Aman, anybody who has some questions or something, we can take up.
Yeah, if anyone has a question.
Yeah,
Yes.
I think there's something in the chat.
Raise your hand. Yeah, one question.
Yeah.
How to make this a profession as a permanent source of income? Like, it's not related to the, but yeah, it's a general question.
Right. So wildlife photography, is like a very difficult field, and since there are very few number of people here, so it's highly competitive. It's not something like which is very common. So making it an income sort of becomes a little difficult unless you're extremely good at it. And one of the best ways to do is to join with an organization. Let's say National Geographic internationally, or you can join an NGO here in India, and you can be a resident photographer / environmentalist / wildlife expert, and then you can have a confirmed income from that place. And otherwise, of course, if you have enough resources, then you can contribute your photographs and send them to various magazines, and but typically you're given projects. Many of these societies like National Geographic, Discovery, the Animal Planet, etc. You're given these projects where you're hired by a photographer who is senior, and he may hire you as well, and you can get a stipend, and then gradually you can improve your craft and become a full-time wildlife photographer. But that said, I feel it's slightly difficult unless you're very sure that this is exactly what you want to do and nothing else. I would always recommend that you take up a full-time career, and side by side go ahead and do wildlife photography. And then if you feel you're getting the hang of it, you're getting the right number of people, the right contacts, then you can always switch over. So maybe start off with something else and branch off to wildlife photography later. At least that's the situation right now. Anything else? Any other question? This was from Shubham, I think, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, so we'll
continue.
Yeah, we'll continue. Right. So now we'll move on to the next part of the presentation, which is types of photography, and we'll just share the presentation here. Now, the types of photography, there's no hard and fast rule, and the list of this classification, so to say, is not really found anywhere. This is more like my experience or my, as a photographer myself, as well as observing others who've been, taking on me. And I feel that these are broadly the types of photography. And the first three, that is night photography, macro, and backlit, are technique-based classification. That is, you're using a particular kind of technique to capture your image. The next two, that is conservation and experimental, are sort of theme-based photography. And the last two, that is landscape and portrait, are frame-based. So basically, you can have a combination of them. You could have a night photography landscape, or let's say a backlit portrait, or let's say a macro, conservation photography. You can have any number of combinations, and of course, you can specialize in something which you really like. So my suggestion to everybody who's starting off and who's just very curious about wildlife, then you go ahead and start with all of these. Do a little bit of all of them, so you'll get to understand what kind of adventure, what kind of thrill you're getting out of it, and maybe then you can later specialize. As for me, I haven't found my specialization till date, because I feel all of them have their own charm and interest. So we talk about each of them one by one through some of my photographs. First, we'll start with night photography. And night photography is a challenge. And why? Well, because there's not enough light. And as we know that exposure is a very major part of photographs. So what do? Well, we use artificial lights, but there's always a warning, and this is something very important. First, we should never use flashes, because many of the creatures in the night are very sensitive to light, and any kind of flashes may temporarily or even permanently blind the creature. Could be a bird, it could be a mammal, it could be a nocturnal creature. So we have to be very careful that there is no flash. There's only one way to do it, and that is using an external source, maybe a flashlight. But then that should be of as low wattage as possible. That's part two. And point three is that particular light should never be aimed directly at the subject, because that is detrimental to the subject. Again, because it's bright light and it may disorient the subject itself. The other point is, which is more utilitarian, is that actually shining light on the subject would cause it to overexpose. And your photograph, when you're actually clicking the photo, you will see that the colors are bleached, and it's a very whitish or yellowish kind of photo with not the natural colors. So I'll show you through examples of what I mean by not shining light directly. Now, this very odd-looking bird is called the great-eared nightjar. It's a nocturnal bird, and this photo is from Thattikad, Kerala. And you can see that it's a very owl-like creature. And if you look carefully, on the right side of the image, you'll see a lot of light behind. There's a background of those greenish areas. So that's because the light was actually towards the right part of the image, not directly aimed at this bird, which is a nocturnal bird. So because of that, I could make out these very different bluish, gray, black, yellow, brown colors, which are otherwise would not have been exposed properly. And here's another zoom photo. That pinkish area is actually its nose. It's taken in such a way that the other eye is hidden behind the nose. So that's the great ear, and you can see the ear kind of thing, but that's not really an ear, just a tuft of hair. And this is the largest nightjar found in the South Asian subcontinent. And here's another example of night photography. So this is a jackal, golden jackal, and this is from Nandur Madhumeshwar in Maharashtra. And we were in the fields, searching for these night birds and all, and then we heard this rustling sound, and we weren't sure what it is, but there was a lot of noise. So we knew it's something large or something big, and we were prepared that it might just make an entrance. So there was a little path, and suddenly it came, bang in front of us, looking directly into the camera. And as you can see again, the light is slightly on the left side. The plant on the left of the jackal is more lit up. That's again because had I shown the light directly on the jackal, the eyes would have been weird, because it had a red eye effect. And at the same time, the colors of the jackal would have been, compromised. Here you can make out the beautiful golden color, why it's called the golden jackal. So this is an example of night photography. And now moving on to macro photography. Now, macro photography can be achieved by cameras, by DSLRs, as well as by mobile phones. And macro photography basically achieves what is literally invisible to the human eye. You are zooming into subjects and creating an alien world which we don't see normally. Because if you focus and zoom in a subject and show its details, especially the insect and the micro flora world, fungi and some kind of a little kind of plants, then these photos can be really astounding to look at, because you don't see them naturally in that size. And here's an example of macro photography. So this is a very common dragonfly. It's called the variegated flutterer, or the common picture wing, and it looks as if there's some picture drawn on its beautiful wings, and it has this stained glass kind of rendering to its wings. And this actually was taken by my mobile phone without any other lens, and my mobile is about 3-4 years old. So you can imagine that this is the kind of technology we have, so we can reach out to very normal looking butterflies and dragonflies and all kinds of insects which you see around. Let's say many of you in the IIT Guwahati campus can actually, once you're back there, or maybe right now where you are, you can actually see these creatures, anywhere. And if you take their photos and zoom in, you'll see that they are very different than what we normally see them to be. So macro photography aims to highlight the unseen world. It is at a very micro level, and hence they can be very interesting examples. Then there's another example of technique-based photography, which is called the backlit photography. And well, backlit photography is basically, what do you normally expect a photograph to be? You would want an animal or a bird to be well lit, which means that the sun should be behind you and it should be falling right on the subject, and hence you'll have good colors, good exposure, etc. But what happens by accident or by choice if the source of light, let's say the sun or otherwise, is behind the subject? Then what happens? So then what happens is that your subject becomes dark. But interestingly, you can have very, very interesting outlines. For example, imagine a furry mammal, let's say a very rare lion-tailed macaque, which is found in southern India. And let's say you want to take a picture of this monkey, and there's the sun behind it. So you won't probably get the details of its face or its other features, but you would be able to get a beautiful golden light on its fur, a fur which is covering its entire body. So that kind of example is backlit. And here's another example of backlit photography. This is again a common butterfly called the blue bottle, and this is from Navi Mumbai, Maharashtra. And you can see that the sun is behind. How do we gauge that? Well, you can see the shadow of the butterfly falling in front of it. So it's towards you, which means the sun was behind the butterfly. And that's why there's this beautiful translucent bluish fluorescent color which has come up. And normally this color is not visible if you're taking a photograph if the sun is falling on the butterfly. It's a blue color, no doubt astounding, resplendent. But if it's behind the photo, it sort of creates a very interesting image. So you can experiment with backlit photography as well. And if you have subjects like this, or let's say a furry or a feathery subject, you can have very interesting results. Then there's something called conservation photography. So we moving from the technique-based, now we're moving to thematic photography. And probably this is the most important photography. As a photographer, we have a moral responsibility to sort of give our work some meaning. And this meaning is that the photographs we capture should be able to raise awareness amongst all stakeholders, amongst people who don't know about wildlife. Well, they should care more about it. And people who are, let's say, policymakers who can appreciate a particular species being driven to extinction or its habitat being destroyed, etc. So conservation photography, through those photos, you're able to highlight certain man-made problems or environmental degradation, etc. And these things can help in the long run. So here's an example of conservation photography, and this is a flock of lesser flamingos. They are these amazing pink, when you look at them, the word comes to you, which is pink. And here they are from Panje, near Panje, Uran in Maharashtra. And you can see there's a lot of industrial activity here. There's a man-made activity happening in the background, which is fine. They don't mind it because they seem to be thriving. But we need to make sure that there's no sewage or let's say kind of effluents being released by the industry into this wetland, because that will end up not only killing their diet, which is let's say the algae and the prawns which they eat, but also the flamingos themselves. So this is an example to show I highlight that how creatures are having this interface between the natural world and the man-made world, and how they can survive in such a situation. Here's another example of conservation photography, and you can see this very odd-looking bird called the Eurasian curlew, and this is from Arnala. It's a beach in Maharashtra, and you can see that the bill of the bird is very long. It's probably having one of the longest bill-to-body ratios, and it's a migratory bird, which means it comes from hundreds of miles, probably from somewhere in Russia, and we are lucky to have these birds coming to India every year. But you can see in the background there's a boat, there's a lot of human activity there, and typically this beach is clean. But the day I was there was a lot of human stench in the background. There was a lot of pollution I felt, and the noise, etc. And there was just this single bird, as if it was the only one which had migrated, and that's sort of disheartening to see that there wasn't a flock. So this is an example to show how Eurasian curlews, which are globally threatened, we need to be sure that they are well fed, and they thrive here, and then they go back to their homeland. So this is an example of how citizens can do something about this. And this is the same bird, Eurasian gullies, but in a much better setting. So you can see that a lot of them happily, talking amongst themselves. One of them on the right is sitting down comfortably. And so this is an example to show that how birds can, given on this in the situation where they are, they can thrive or they can, gradually decline. So it's up to us to, raise awareness and do our bit to make sure that these creatures survive. Here's another example of conservation photography, and very, it doesn't look as if it's conservation, but it is. And this is from Marine Drive, Mumbai. Many of you might even recognize it. And on the left side, you can see there's some feeding happening. There's a lady who's feeding. There's some kind of food. So you might just remark that how is it bad? How is it affecting wildlife anyways? By the way, these birds are not local. They are migratory. They are the black-headed gulls, the brown-headed gulls, and many of them are juveniles, which means that they are just learning to hunt, to feed, and that's where this feeding is crucially, fatal to them. The first reason is that most of the food we offer is not meant for them. It's too oily, too sugary, too spicy, and it's not good for their systems. They're not meant to digest these things. And the second one is that many of them, as I said, they are juveniles, which means that they're just learning the nuances of hunting. They need to understand how to dive in the water, how to catch the fish, how to assess the wind speed, etc. And here they are depending on human. So if their dependence gradually increases so much, then they will actually lose their instinct to hunt. And that actually leads to a population collapse. So maybe our intention was fine, maybe just to feed these birds, but eventually we were actually causing a lot of damage to them. And that's why one of the reasons I call this the caption of this photo as "When Kindness Can Kill." So that's exactly what's happening. Really, the intention probably wasn't bad, but we have to be sure that we are well aware of what impact it does to these birds. So it's better to let them be, and they are very happy hunting. You just let them be; they'll be fine. They don't need our food really. So we are just spoiling them for no reason. So now we move on to the next type of photography, which is experimental photography. And experimental photography, as the name suggests, you sort of twist the rules. You don't have to follow any particular rule of thirds or framing or aperture, etc. It's entirely up to you. You take up a subject and let your fancy guide your final image. So some of them we'll see. And this is a beautiful bird called the glossy ibis. It does justice to the word glossy, as you can see. And it's a water bird, and most of the time it looks very blackish. It's very dull colored, but at the right angle, it lights up like this. So you can literally see all the colors of a rainbow here. And on the right side, you see a blob, blackish blob, kind of thing. That's a bird. That's another bird. And I didn't want any other bird in the frame. So had I moved the frame towards the right, according to the rule of thirds, then the bird would have come in the frame. And I didn't have a choice because this was a very short moment. It just happened for a second. So I decided to move the frame in the other way and took this photo. So it doesn't follow any particular rule, but I just wanted the clean background without any other color so that the viewer can just look at these amazing colors and marvel at this creation. And that's the same bird, the glossy ibis, two of them fighting, let's say, probably over territory. And this is another experimental photography. And why is it experimental? Well, ideally, you would have wanted the feathers to be very sharp, but I didn't want that. I wanted them to be a little blurred. So I was prepared for it. I was in a boat. This is from Big One, Maharashtra, the other one too. And as I was waiting, I knew something was happening. We were just about to begin this fight. So I knew there was some action which is going to come. So I was prepared, and I quickly tweaked my settings. And I made sure that the shutter speed was fast enough to capture these golden droplets. You can see it's sunset. So there are a lot of drops flying around. And at the same time, the shutter speed shouldn't be so fast that the feathers get clear. I wanted the motion blur sort of, so to give a highlight of a dynamism into the photo, as if they are too fast for the camera. So this way you can communicate through experimental photography. And here's another example. This is the Malabar grey hornbill from Dandeli, Karnataka, and you can see that there's a lot of fruits around. It's a fig family, and that evening there were hundreds of hornbills flying around, and I was lucky that I saw this miracle. But at the same time, I wanted this photo to be non-conventional. Typically, what would you want? You want the photo to be the bird to be, let's say, perched on an open perch with no distractions, a clear background, and nothing in the foreground, etc. But on the contrary, I wanted to capture this bird in its element. and try to hide it amongst its own food and capture the joy which it was experiencing, happily feeding away. So I moved behind a little bit, and without following the rule of thirds, and without following the aperture being having a very shallow depth of field, I actually landed up with this photo. So this is one of my favorites. And moving on to the next type, which is landscape photography. And landscape photography, as we know, the landscape talks about the overall habitat of where a bird or where an animal lives, and it highlights that how a particular bird or animal interacts with its habitat. So here's an example. This is the great Indian bustard, the GIB, and it's one of the rarest birds in India. There's just about 100, 200 of them left, and I'm afraid that this bird, if it gets extinct, would probably be the first species of animal to get extinct in independent India. So we need to be aware of this beautiful bird, which was actually a runner-up to be the national bird of India at one point. And it's because of a variety of factors, it's facing a lot of threats, in its habitat. And the habitat, as you can see, it's very dry, very barren. It lives in the desert. This was taken in Jaisalmer. After 4 days of hunting for this bird, finally on the 4th day we were returning, and I had almost given up hope. I was sure that probably we'll not see it because it's too difficult to see this bird. It's just 100 in number, and it's a vast area. So you really need to move around and see, and if you're lucky, you see it. So on the 4th day, while we were returning, our guide Radhesham, he quickly shouted "Gudavan, Gudavan." Gudavan is the local name of the GIP. And that's where where we saw this bird, and it was happily walking proudly like a sentinel of the sands. And it is an overwhelming moment to see this bird. Nothing short of a miracle, and I would probably say this sighting was even more thrilling than seeing a tiger. So this is an example of landscape photography. And here's another example of landscape where you see a golden jackal approaching a purple heron on the right side. And the purple heron is very, very sharp. It has a long neck, so you can actually see this creature approaching it. And you can see why its habitat is important. You can see there's a lot of water-based plants, there's a lot of reeds, there's a lot of trees behind, wetlands. This is from Nandur Madhameshwar, which, by the way, is a Ramsar wetland recently declared in Maharashtra. And so this is an example of how habitats are very crucial to understand the dynamics of relationship between the creatures, how they interact among themselves and with their surroundings. And moving on to probably the last type of photography, and which is probably the most impressive, because, well, when you look at wildlife photography, this is what really catches your eye most of the times. Portrait photography is something which you actually capture animal portraits and their expressions, their features, and I think portrait photography communicates like no other, and it probably attracts the most viewers and photographers alike. So here's an example of portrait. This is a common rhesus monkey, looking up into the sky. This is actually captured at near my home. My home happens to be very close to the zoo, and they roam around this area, and that's an example of portrait. And here's another portrait. This is from Jaisalmer, around the outskirts of Jaisalmer, the desert national park. And this is the chinkara, which is the Indian gazelle, the only species of gazelle found in India. And we were in a car, and you can see that it looks as if it's a two-headed animal. And this was a very short 2-second kind of moment when they were looking bang into me, at me, and they were like judging whether I would get off the car or try to disturb them. But they didn't give me any benefit of doubt. They just paused for a second and they bolted, because they're very fast, very agile creatures. And here's another example of a beautiful bird called the crimson-backed sunbird. This is again from Karnataka, and you can see that the colors are ranging from turquoise to crimson to brown, purple, mauve, maroon, yellow, lime, etc. And this bird is endemic, which means that it is found only in the Western Ghats and nowhere in the world. And hence, it's these kind of photographs can actually communicate and tell locals as well as people who are interested in wildlife that these are species we need to be aware of before they even disappear from face of Earth. And here's another example of the vultures. Well, vultures, as you know, they have been declining. And this was taken in Jaisalmer, but thankfully there's a large population of vultures just beginning to thrive. And one of the reasons which actually led to the decline of vultures was the presence of a drug called diclofenac. And diclofenac was fed to cows, And when these cows used to die, it's a painkiller. And when these cows used to die, these vultures used to feed on these dead bodies. And as a result, they used to ingest the medicine, and this medicine used to prove fatal to them. They would die very quickly, and because of that, we lost about 99% of our population. They were in millions. Vultures used to be in millions in prior to 1990s, and now they are in thousands or hundreds. Some species have declined so drastically, and thankfully, we have imposed a ban on this drug. It's no longer available, for especially for cattle. And vultures are gradually rebounding. We have some centers, which conservation centers, where where we are breeding them and releasing them to the wild. But the point what I'm trying to make is that because of vultures being absent from the food chain, as you know, they're scavengers. Because of that, somebody else has taken their place, and that is feral dogs. You might have seen the dog population increase a lot. Have you ever wondered why? Well, that's because the vultures have gone. And the vultures have gone means that they have extra food. There's a lot of food left over. Who takes over? Well, dogs, because they can now thrive. They have more food, they have more resources, so their populations thrive, they multiply, their kids are able to, or the pups are able to, survive more because they have more food. As a result, because they are not effective disposers of dead bodies, because they don't finish the dead bodies completely, it gives the dead bodies enough time to have these microorganisms develop, and you have these various pandemics, epidemics falling, across the globe. So do you understand how the relationship between distinctly managing a population of something which is so unconnected to us can actually have a direct impact on us? These epidemics and everything, one of the major reasons is probably because of vulture population being so low. And if thankfully in the future we are able to increase their population, hopefully we'll be able to get back on track, because they are effective scavengers. They completely clean the body without leaving any trace for any microorganisms to foster or develop. So that's an example of conservation photography. And here, of course, is one of my favorites. This is a leopard called Rambo, and this is from Jalana, Rajasthan. And there's a greenish patch on the eye, which is actually a twig which came between me and the subject. But I didn't have the time to sort of adjust my position, because I just wanted to capture its beautiful look, light, looking very intensely into the camera. And it is a very low light. The sun had set. And that's why the colors are very different. They are more reddish, goldenish because of the setting sun. And it looks like an South American jaguar. So here's another portrait. And that brings us to an end of the types of photography. If you want, I can take a quick pause, and then we can move on to photo stories.
Yeah, we have some interesting questions. Like we have
Yeah.
in our college also, we have a photography club, right? So
Okay.
many of the students are from there.
Right.
This Akshita Jain over here, who
Yeah.
asked, as an IAS officer, how much time and opportunities do you get for wildlife photography?
Right.
I am also into wildlife photography for the past 7 years, and
Wow.
aim to be an Indian Forest Service officer.
Excellent, excellent. Akshada, I hope you are, you join the Forest Service, and then I come to whichever wildlife sanctuary you're posted in. That's what my dream is. So, you should study hard, and it's so nice to know that you've been into wildlife photography for nearly 7 years. I'm sure you're probably more experienced than I am, because, well, I've been doing, doodling around and have these photos. To answer your question about how much time and opportunities, well, I would say when I was in Mumbai, I would spend almost every other weekend to go on these trips. So you can imagine every year has about 52 weekends. And if you, let's say, spend 20, 25 of them on these sanctuaries, or going and exploring India all across, you would have a wealth of knowledge. And every weekend, every trip, makes you a more experienced person, both in terms of photography, of course, but in terms of understanding animal behavior. And that's very important. So when you're actually in a habitat, you sort of understand, okay, this particular creature will behave in this way, or this bird is about to fly, so I should get ready and take a picture. So this example, understand that this actually illustrates how important it is to spend time, because there's no substitute for spending time, and I'm happy that you already spent a lot of time, but make sure that while weekends. And in my case, well, I even actually went in early mornings as well. And I'll give you an example. There was a bird called the little crake. And the little crake is a very rare bird. It's a winter visitor, and we don't normally see this bird around, because it hides in the marshes and is found in the reeds. So it's very difficult to see it. So I came to know, I was in Mumbai at the time, posted there, and I came to know that this is found in the outskirts of Pune, in a place called so every day before going to office, I used to actually get up at 3:34 in the morning, go to Pune, capture these photographs and get back in time to office. So that also is possible. It's entirely up to you. If you're really passionate about something, and if you're really crazy about getting the being in the moment and able to sort of see this bird or see a particular animal, then you should go for it, and there's no restriction. So there's enough time and opportunity. All you need to do is make sure you have the willingness to do it. And if you have it, then the time is automatically created, and your work doesn't suffer. You're a great work. Your time is not sort of affected. In fact, many times I see that when I go early mornings to see flamingos or to see other birds, that day really goes well. I am more productive that day. So I think it charges you up. There's a lot of dopamine, and I think that helps you. So I hope that answers your question, Akshita, and all the very best.
Yeah, we have another similar question, but I think there's one more point
Uh-huh.
included. Uh, like the question is, wildlife photography requires a lot of patience and time. So how did you manage this along with being an IS
Right.
officer? And how did your career in wildlife photography
Okay.
start? Is it through session or from somewhere
Right.
else?
Right. Well, thank you. And who's the person who's asking? I would like to know the name.
He's Abhishek.
Abhishek. Right.
He's a student of mine.
Okay, right, Abhishek. Thank you for the question. So, Abhishek, well, as I said, the time, of course, you have to take out time for this kind of thing, and you need to, whenever you get the time, you sort of know that you have to go here, or you plan a trip. So, a lot of my trips were planned at the last moment. When I realized that there's nothing on the weekend, there's no work, then I would, quickly plan a trip, and let's say go to Kerala, go to Nagaland. I'll talk about that Nagaland trip as well. And literally having gone to all these states, and staying there and waiting for the moment to arrive, it actually is very thrilling. And one of the reasons why this patience is important is because a lot of people go there with some agenda. That when you're going in a tiger safari, you would want to see a tiger, right? A lot of people have this kind of presumption that yes, this is something which I want to see. But with me, at least, that's what I recommend also to a lot of people, is that never have any expectation of seeing a particular kind of creature, or seeing this. Yes, you can have it in the background. Okay, maybe it would be nice to see it, but don't put it very high up on your agenda. Because why? You would probably not see that creature, but something else you might see doing something very different, or maybe even very routine, but which is very memorable, and you might get an excellent photo which you would have never expected. So you have to be patient. You just wait for the moment. You sit down and you listen to the sounds, listen to a particular creature moving here or there, or a bird moving from one spot to the other, and you might have a very interesting story in front of you. So that's very important, and you can always find time for something which you really want to go for. And as far as starting wildlife photography, well, this was something since childhood. I mean, I wasn't a photographer, but I was always interested in animals and birds, and what they would do, what their stories are, how do they live a normal day. We have a normal day planned out so well. What do these creatures do? What do they, and how do they interact? So, and especially because my home, as I said, is very near to the zoo, and I remember as a child, I used to hear these roars of the tigers during my evenings, and I used to wonder that what this tiger would be doing right now. It's a very different kind of experience. And when I grew up, when I gradually had the opportunity to use my camera, I was always a photographer. And this wildlife photography maybe developed after college, soon after I joined service, because I had the chance to go to so many places, and then I met a lot of wonderful people, especially in the forest department, who and then we sort of started going out to different sanctuaries and national parks. And then after that, of course, I had some trainings, in wildlife photography, in bird courses, from BNHS in Mumbai. And these things helped me, a little bit of knowledge, both theoretical and practical, helped me to grow. So even right now, whenever I get a chance, I attend workshops. Besides giving boring workshops like this, I also attend some, and that increases my experiences. So that always helps. So always keep an open mind, I think. And Akshita, I think, has commented very well. Said, sir, early mornings are surely the best time for
Yeah.
photography. Would love to have you if you have your questions of Sanctuary. Thank you. Yes, absolutely, Akshita. All the very best. Right.
Yes.
Uh,
I'd like to take
Shubha,
more questions. You
I think,
continue.
yeah, just one more question, then we can move on. I think there's Rakesh.
Yes.
Oh,
Sai Chandan.
yeah.
Yeah.
Do you have this list, no? From Sachidanand, Mayur.
Yeah.
Okay. So maybe we
Yeah.
can take
So
the,
Sachidanand has the question.
yeah.
Okay, I have been doing photography, but through my mobile phone at college.
Hmm.
Now I wish to to camera? What kind of device should I look for being a beginner in this
Right.
field?
So okay, that's good to know, Sachin, that you're already doing mobile photography. But somebody who's really interested into photography quickly gets bored, of mobile phones, especially if you're not into macro. See, macro is something different. Macro you can continue using your mobile phones. But the camera which I would suggest as a beginner is a P900, let's say, a Nikon camera which has this built-in zoom lens. So why do I recommend this is because the zoom can help you achieve that distance. More often than not, the wildlife which you see will be very far. These photographs that you're seeing, like as if they are very close to you, are actually very far, because I use a very long telephoto lens. So they sort of bring the subject closer to you, because it's sometimes very difficult to interact very closely to the wildlife, especially if you're going as a novice. If you have some experience and and then the bird also recognizes this particular individual, that bird might give you some benefit of doubt, may let you even come close, but more often than not, that's not the case. So P900 is a great way to start, and you can do some market research, and whichever camera suits your budget. But I would recommend you start off with a non-DSLR camera which has an inbuilt zoom lens, so that you can experiment your subjects and get to know what you really like. And then after that, maybe move on to a DSLR camera with lenses which can be bought separately. So can you name some more brands, models of cameras which are perfect for like? So there's no particular. This is from Mayur Saikia, and Mayur. There's no particular brand or model which can be particularly for wildlife. But then you look for certain things like a good sensor. That's very important, especially in low light. So that is something which, if you look for in various cameras, I think that should be a deciding factor. Besides, going for a full frame or a cropped frame, that sort of is your decision. Because a lot of times people prefer full frame to crop frame. Then we can talk about that if you have some questions, and I'll probably give my Instagram handle as well. You can reach out to me. But as of now, no particular brands or models. But generally, your technique is more important, I would say. The next is that macro photography in flora is a valuable thing. I'm studying botany, and it's valuable means how to exposure. Okay, so Abdul, right? So Abdul, yes, that sounds good. If you are studying botany, then you can probably look at very interesting microflora. Things like algae, things like bryophytes and thallophytes, and things we used to study them in school, or even pteridophytes. You can have very interesting photos of ferns, especially with the spores and all. And you can have mushrooms. You can have very tiny micro level flowers coming up from various different kind of plants. So you could do a project, something like microflora in your district, or microflora in your campus, microflora in and around your city. It could be something which you take up, and you could publish a research paper on that, or, and you can there's something which you can do at any level at any time, because because with plants, thankfully, you have that advantage that they don't move, so you can give as much time as you want, and take good photos, and do a project on that, something whichever you like. Rakesh asks how to start wildlife photography. I'm keenly interested but don't know how to start. Well, Rakesh, the first thing is go to wildlife parks or national parks. You go there, experience the wild, and see what it speaks to you. See what kind of creatures are you looking at? Are you looking more at eagles, or are you looking more at let's say tiny birds, or butterflies, or snakes, or tigers? What is it that you like? First try to get an idea of what you like, and then gradually build upon that. And that is first. And I would recommend, if you do not have any background in photography, then start with a binocular, because that will give you a sense of how far the creatures are. And then you can probably go ahead with, as I said, go for a camera which is let's say low budget, so that you can start off with something, and then experience wildlife photography. And then Shubham asks, it's hard to capture animals as they can attack, and if they feel insecure, so how do you get through this? Yeah, that's a very good question, Shubham. In fact, it is more in the interest of animals than us to not go very close to them, let's say leopard, etc. The only thing is, when you are there in their presence, they are looking at you and you're looking at them. Do not give any kind of signal which is a threat to them. So don't tease them. Don't try to clap. Don't try to shout so that they sort of react and you get a nice shot. Don't do any of that sort. And just stay calm. Don't unnecessarily panic. Maybe take a picture or a shot you want, and then gradually move away. Of course, more often than not, you will be in a car, because many wildlife sanctuaries and national parks do not allow you to walk on foot. So that's actually fine. And many creatures don't really harm you. We actually are very human beings are very they have a very negative image in the animal kingdom. So animals just want to get away from us. They don't really attack us more often than not, unless we sort of pursue it. And otherwise, it's always better if you're going in such an area where you have wild elephants or wild creatures which are known to be very aggressive if they in times, then it's always better to have a local guide or a local person, because they understand how they react and they know various routes through which you can go, and that can always help you. So don't venture alone, especially if you're inexperienced. Always go with somebody who knows the place, right? And yes, Shubham says 400 to 600 mm lens. Yes, that's good, Shubham. It's a good choice for wildlife photography. 400 to 600 mm. Anything above 300 mm is excellent for wildlife, because typically that is the range you want for birds or animals which are very far off. So I think that's the questions as of now. We can move on.
Yes. Yes, all the
Lovely.
questions are
So
answered.
let's move on, and now we talk about some photo stories. And photo stories will tell you how photos can communicate certain memories and certain stories which can come to life if you're there. And here's the first one. This is called The Family. I hope the PPT is visible.
Yes,
Great.
yes, sir.
So here's the family. This is so I was in Chambal, and this is a bird called the Indian thick-knee. It looks a very odd-looking bird. It lives near reeds and water, wetlands near rivers and beaches and all. And I was behind. I was in a boat behind these birds, and I was watching them very intently. And I was wondering what would their next step be and what would they be doing. And I just thought maybe I should wait. And there was something about these two, because normally if you have two of them together, then that means there could be somebody around. And sure enough, just minutes away, I saw this beautiful little chick come up, and this was a mom, dad, and their child, and they were very protectively looking at me, and they were saying that, okay, get out of this place because we have to eat and feed around. And believe me, till the time I was there, they did not take their eyes off me. They did not move. They just did not let the chick go anywhere else. The chick itself was trying to fiddle here and there. And it was very difficult to capture this particular photo because this chick was moving around. And but then thankfully, the moment I moved around, they were very happy. They started feeding, and the chick, of course, had no idea of what happened. It was busy feeding. So this is an example of how photo stories can show these beautiful, lovely moments where you understand how the universal feeling of motherhood and or parenthood is actually found everywhere in the animal kingdom as well. So this is an example. And here's another story called The Uninvited Guest. And this was in Nagarhole, Karnataka. And as you can see, these are the spotted deer. I was watching them, and they were very happily feeding, and they sort of they were not disturbed by my presence, and they were okay with that. But suddenly they looked up. That's when I took this photo, and they sort of suddenly bolted. The entire flock, the entire group, which is about 30 or 40 of them, suddenly just decided to run away. And I had an idea why this could be, and I was waiting for the right moment, and sure enough, just seconds later, this happened. A female tigress stepped right in front of us, and she probably had smelled them, and so the deer had smelled tiger or whatever. They had the sense that there's some tigers around, so they ran quickly, and this tigress obliged. You can see this beautiful golden color, golden orange right in front of us. And later, he actually, gave a frontal portrait as well. So you can see, but my hands were shaking. This was, an early time when I was just beginning to start photography, and I was lucky to capture the tiger at the very beginning. But my hands were shaking. I was so excited, and that's why it's not very clear. You might probably, make out. So. And then this, another story is called Mother's Love. And here we have this little, the lesser whistling duck. This is from Kanpur, my hometown. In fact, this is during the lockdown period, very recently, about 2 months back. And, you can see these beautiful little chicks around, feeding, and mom is trying to teach them how to eat, how to swim, how to feed. Everything is going fine. And suddenly, these two swamp hens come on the left side, and these chicks were, very scared of them. So you can see the chicks going towards their mom. You can see on the right side, and the mom has this huge, big mouth open, and she's screaming at these two swamp hens, telling them to, get away from this, from my chicks. And it's very protective, very angry. So you can see again how a range of human emotions, being protective, being angry, and these kind of things really make you question how much we underestimate animals. Their emotions are pretty much our own spectrum. Maybe not that complicated in terms of abstractness, but the basic emotions are there. So that's again sort of very important for us to realize that, because unless we are in nature, unless we are observing these things, we'll never be really truly sensitive to what we are actually destroying. So this is the lesser whistling duck. And here's another example, and this arguably is my favorite bird, called the lesser florican. I'm yet to meet some bird which is more adorable, more fun-filled than this bird. And this lesser florican is found in it's actually seen in Rajasthan during the monsoon months, but during the non-monsoon months we had no idea where it goes. And before I go into anything, I'll show you this video, and hopefully that this video will show that what this amazing bird does. This is during monsoons. It's ritual. And there you go. I'll play the video again just in case there was a lag. This is the lesser florican. There. So I hope you heard there was a little tattling sound as well. And this bird does this jumping up and down 200 times a day, and that's his mating ritual. This is a male looking for females around, and it jumps up and down just to display, just like the peacock sort of displays its feathers. This lesser florican does the same thing. And this is how the bird looks like. It has a beautiful little crest on its head, black colored crest and black body. And this is an endangered bird, again from the Great Indian Bustard family. It's actually a little bustard only, and there's just about 2,000 of them left. So we have to be very careful because it's a grassland bird, and many of the grasslands are being destroyed. So every time I see this bird, I get goosebumps, and that was the first time I saw this bird, and I was just struck by the awesome energy and relentless jumping which it does throughout the day. And the next story is the sky of falcons. And well, falcons, they're supposed to be very aggressive creatures, but these aren't, and they're called the Amur falcons. And here is what you see. There are about 2 lakh falcons flying right above you, and this is in Nagaland, the trip which I was mentioning earlier. So I took 14 hours from Mumbai to Nagaland, through a flight, through a car, through a bus, and then finally landed up in this place just to see these birds for about 8 hours, and then I had to travel back. This was on the weekend because I couldn't take a leave on my working day. But it was totally worth it, because these birds are actually passage migrants. They come from Siberia, somewhere in Amur. Amur is a Russian river, and the areas they come from there. They stop over at Nagaland in large numbers, and then they proceed to South Africa for they finally wintering there. So India is very lucky that it has this annual congregation in this state, and I was lucky to see them. And this is how they look up close. So the one which is flying is a male, and the one which is shying away on the left is the female. So that's the Amur falcons. And here's another experience which I was lucky to have, and this was in Papua New Guinea. Some people might know it. This is one of my a couple of international experiences I had in wildlife photography, and I actually planned this trip just for watching these birds, the birds of paradise as they're called. And their dances, their colors are so unique. And one of the major reasons is because they don't have any predators. So there are no hunting animals or mammals found on the island which could have destroyed them birds. So these birds became very colorful, very loud, and you won't see these kind of colors in one particular family. So there are about 40 odd birds of paradise found in that entire region. And I'll just show you one example of this western Perutia bird, and you'll see that it takes a bow before performing, and it dances, and here it is. So there's a bow, and then you can see that it's opening up its skirt, something like a skirt, and then it goes around. So the male is dancing, and the female is above on the twig, looking at the male, checking out every single move, analyzing whether he'd be a good potential mate or not. And the male is doing a wonderful job. There's another female, as you can see, she's also watching him. So he does these interesting moonwalking steps, jerking and twerking, and the females are very interested, and the fluttering of the wing shows that they're interested. So his efforts are paying off, and the entire the ground which you see is clear because the male has cleared it. Each leaf You can see in the background that there's a lot of leaves and stones lying around, but the performing area, the male clears it all. And imagine the kind of effort which goes into it. So it chooses this area where the female can come on top, on the twigs, and look at him from above. So this is an example to show how amazing wildlife can be. And this is an example of the same bird, maybe in a very ghostly, otherworldly appearance. So that brings us to the end of photography, and I'll quickly give you an example of these courses, which some of you might like doing. They are on birds and animals and reptiles and conservation and photography, all kinds of areas. You can probably take a screenshot of it right now. And this, many people, because of your lockdown, etc., many of them are online courses. So if you have the time, if you have the energy, and if you are really keen into wildlife photography or wildlife in general, you can pursue many of these courses. And this will actually help you, increase your knowledge base, both as a naturalist as well as a photographer. So I hope this would help you. And you can reach me at these, Instagram at Raghav Gupta 7, or email me at raghavgupta7@gmail.com, and you can take a screenshot of this as well. And now we are open to questions. So, yeah, go ahead.
Yes,
Yeah.
sir. We have one question here in the question box. Sir, most of our time is suppressed by job or studies or other responsibilities, and very less people are able to cope
With
up
both.
with both. So, any suggestions in general
Right.
for the one who like to pursue their
Very good.
passions?
Absolutely. It's a very relevant question. And Abdul, it's very important. But आपने बिल्कुल सही सवाल पूछा, and it's very important because people should be aware of, what your passions are. So right now, this lockdown period is very important. I was telling, I think somebody very recently also, that this is an opportunity which has proved to be very difficult for a lot of people. But for people who have a home, who are at their homes and they have enough time on their hands, utilize this creatively. Get an idea of what you want from this life. What do you want to pursue academically, what you want to do, let's say, as a job, what you want to do as a hobby, and make sure that you have this clarity that you want to spend some time on it. So importantly, anything you want to excel at, I would say that you need to spend about 10,000 hours on that. So if you choose something that is really passionate to you, or you something which if it's a hobby which is very dear to you, that is the amount of time you need to spend, then that is when you'll be excellent at it. That is not the aim, of course. If you don't want to excel, you just want to spend time and have a something which is a stress buster for you, go ahead, because only if you're happy can you keep people around you happy. So that is very important. And the source of happiness you have to understand. That is, if it's something which gives you pleasure, if it's a hobby which is something which you haven't given enough time to, then make sure that you take out some time. And it can be done. The same 24 hours are available to everybody on earth. Yet some people can take out time. How do they do that? Well, because they have prioritized it. So maybe spend a little time less on, let's say, WhatsApp, or let's say on gaming or Netflix. I'm not saying they're bad things, but because we have such limited time, now there's so many resources available, from entertainment to all kinds of things, we sort of get lost in this technological era, and we lose the basics. And our basics are how to be happy, and happiness doesn't come from mobile phones. It's a very short-term happiness. A like or a commenting piece is a very short level of dopamine, and you're happy, you get a kick from it, and then you later crash. But something which you want, which is something which is more long-term, is a hobby. It could be painting, singing, playing an instrument. It could be wildlife photography. It could be running, sports, anything. So make sure you find what that particular hobby is and stick on to it. That is your life source. So don't let it go. Don't give up on that hobby just because of responsibilities like studies or work or family, anything. Let nothing come between you and your first love. And your first love should be one of your hobbies, because that is something which will remain for the rest of your life, and it will help you to be happy, to be more productive, and to be more receptive to everything around you, including your family, including your work, including everything else. So it's actually in the best interest of you and others around you.
Yeah, like we have just one more question. Can you please suggest some courses for landscape, architectural, and macro photography?
Okay, so this is from Shuchi. Shuchi, well, I'm not particularly sure. I think there's a TGC course which I mentioned, but you can Google it. There's no particular reason why a particular course should be chosen, why shouldn't be. Anything which suits you in terms of time, in terms of budget, go ahead for it. Because ultimately, a lot of it has to do with your own practice. So what these courses will do, most of them, they'll give you a broad idea of what techniques, let's say architectural photography will do. They will talk about, let's say, particular types of architecture. They will give you an example of what kind of techniques you can use, night, evening, daytime photography, etc. And then they will obviously want some field work. So essentially, you can get these inputs from any course online. So there's no particular course which I would recommend. Anything which you can Google it and you find, go ahead, do that. But make sure you do a couple of them, which are available. And then most importantly, do field work. Go ahead and explore one of the forts or palaces or modern buildings if you're interested in modern architecture, and then get these photographs. So you'll be more happy and you'll understand what kind of changes, what kind of improvements you can do in your photographs as well. So I think that's very important, actual experience. Then I think Shubham had asked me, okay, sir, actually I'm from Himachal and nearby me I don't have any wildlife sanctuaries. We go in forests, we don't have anyone else there who can save us. So well, Shubham, so you don't have to necessarily go into wildlife sanctuaries or national parks. In fact, a lot of wildlife is actually found outside these reserved or preserved forests, conserved forests. So you go ahead and ensure that the locals know about this forest and that stays protected. So if you see some kind of species or see some kind of birds which are not found normally other places, then you go ahead and educate the locals and say that don't cut trees and try to preserve that habitat as it is. That will help saving that particular habitat. Right. So is there any other question?
Yes. Yes, I think that's it.
Yeah.
Almost all the questions are answered.
Great. So no other questions, I hope. I will be signing off then.
Yes.
Great.
Any final or tips?
Well, final tips are, as I said, Rahul, that people should spend time. That's very important, especially for a wildlife photographer. The more you spend time with nature, the more you spend time with wildlife, the more you will, understand what you've been missing out. Because a lot of us, we spend time in our offices or in our homes or in our campuses, and we don't go out. And that's something which restricts us from understanding what is actually happening. There's a whole world out there. There's a whole world of wild creatures and animals and birds living, breathing, dying, and we are not aware of it. Why? Because we are stuck in our own sweet little rooms. So get out once in a while, maybe with a friend or two of yours, and explore these natural habitats. That's something which will give you a very different perspective. You will turn out to be more balanced, and it will help you heal. It has this amazing therapeutic value which is not found, I think, for anything else. So nature is our best, saving grace. We have to make sure that we are in tune with nature. That's my last piece.
Great.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, Aman. Thank you, Rahul. And it was a pleasure again speaking with you guys. So
it was our pleasure. Yes, sir.
It
was great having you.
Thank you so much. Thank you. And whenever we get a chance, we'll catch up, and I'm always available for any kind of questions, any kind of help.
Sure, sir. If we are in the campus, it would have been definitely much better.
I know, absolutely. It's high on my agenda. I have to now that I know that you guys are there, I'll definitely plan a trip, because Northeast is on my radar every year. Every year I make a trip to Arunachal or someplace. So next time I'll stop over at IIT, say hello to you guys, and then go ahead.
Sure, sir. Sure,
yes,
sir.
Sir. You can come anytime, sir.
Right. Nice talking. Nice meeting with you guys. Bye-bye.
Bye.
I think we can end the session.
Yeah, we can end the session.
Yes.